Hello, I am Jolene Hendrix, the Program Manager for the University of Minnesota Extension Pesticide Safety and Environmental Education Program. I specifically work with the commercial and non-commercial applicators in Minnesota. I'm here to talk to you today about pesticide storage practices and cover some considerations and recommendations to minimize your risk of exposure. I'm so sorry I couldn't be with you at the MNLA conference today, but we're going to make this as interactive as possible. And so, everybody should have received a small little answer sheet. You're going to write your name on the top of that answer sheet because you're going to be able to turn that in at the end of the presentation for a chance to win a door prize. Essentially, as I go through the presentation, we'll have questions that are presented. Just answer those questions as we move along. Some of our questions are short answer. Some are simply A, B, C, or D. Whatever you need to do to write that down, just make sure you get it on the little sheet of paper so that you can turn that in. Now, I'm going to cover a little bit on pesticide characteristics, some SDS and pesticide label information, and we're going to talk a little bit about ideal practices when it comes to storage and transportation. Now, first question, when is it possible to spill a pesticide? I want you to write a very short answer, but be specific. So when is it possible to spill a pesticide? I'm going to give you a few seconds to write this down. All right, now let's look and see what we got. There is potential for pesticide incidents and accidents at any point in time during the distribution chain. So everything from starting with the manufacturer to sending those over through the distributors to the dealers. Once you get them as applicators, you put them in the storage, you start mixing in, loading them for your applications. Then you go out and make applications, and ultimately at some point you're going to be disposing of either product or rinsate. And so anywhere along this chain is where incidents can happen and accidents can happen. All right, question number 2, where will you find information about proper pesticide storage and disposal? Again, you can write down A, B, C, or D here. A would be the pesticide label, B, the safety data sheet, C, both the pesticide label and the safety data sheet, or D, none of these. I'll give you a few seconds to write down your answer. All right, let's see how you did. The correct answer is C. You will find information on both the pesticide label and the safety data sheet, but I'm going to get into some discussion about how those are going to vary. All right, so let's look at where we're going to find this information. I have little excerpts here. One is from the SDS, the safety data sheet, and the other one is from a pesticide label example. If you are still calling it an MSDS, you're about 7 years behind the curve because the MSDS was thrown out the window in 2015 and replaced with SDS. It has a standardized format with, I think, 21 different sections, or it might be 17. Anyway, it's very standardized. So if you still have MSDS sheets in your folders, in your files, you need to get rid of those and update them because information has been renewed. Now, when we look at these storage and disposal requirements, generally the pesticide label is going to be very generic. It's going to tell you whether or not you can reuse that container, how to clean it before disposal, and then whether or not you can recycle it, and then what to do with it if you can't recycle it. The SDS, however, is going to usually provide a little bit more information, but it should not contradict the pesticide label. So in this case, you're going to have some information about storage itself. So it tells you do not contaminate water, other pesticides, fertilizer, food, or feed. Make sure you store it in its original container. Keep them tightly closed. I'm not going to read all the rest of it to you, but if there were any hazards here, they may also provide that information, whereas the pesticide label will not. So I'm going to cover very briefly these pesticide characteristics, and you should be familiar. If you're not, this is something that you might want to brush up on, these little icons that are present, because you will see these on the SDS sheets and they are relevant to a lot of our pesticide products. But we're going to cover some of these characteristics very briefly relative to why you need to know this information. All right, so now we're on question 3. What information on a pesticide label indicates the relative toxicity of that product? And here on your little answer sheet, again, you can write A, B, C, or D. Is it A, the directions for use, B, the signal word, C, the first aid information, or D, the personal protective equipment required? I'm going to give you just a few seconds to write down an answer on your answer sheet. All right, let's see if you got B, the signal word. So we talk about those signal words: caution, warning, danger, danger, poison. Those are the words that tell you the relative toxicity of that product. Remember, none of our products, no pesticide is safe. We should never use that word. We talk about it in relative toxicity. So whether it is relatively toxic, moderately toxic, slightly toxic, whether there's minimal risk or whether there's high risk, but we don't ever use the word safe. All right, so again, let's talk a little bit more about toxicity from the backside. Health hazard. So the SDS is going to provide you with numbers like LD50. And some of you may be very familiar with these numbers, but LD50 is basically the lethal dose that kills 50% of a test population. So what they do is they take this pesticide and they start injecting animals. A lot of times we start with rats, but now we're starting to test on multiple types of animals because we recognize that rats and the correlation with humans are not the only things that are harmed by these. They administer these doses, and whatever dose kills half of that population, that's considered the LD50, and that's where we do some correlations to find out the relative toxicity. But LD50s don't tell us whether it causes other significant harm. So it's not going to tell us whether or not it made a rat sterile, or whether it grew tumors but didn't die, or whether it developed cancer over time. So those things we don't get from this information. We only get acute responses as to whether or not they died from that injection. But it may list specific routes of entry. So in this case, we talk about inhalation, dermal, and oral. So, at what rate are you most affected from this particular chemical? And in this case, if you look at the concentrations, the smaller the number, the more toxic it is. So it looks like inhalation at 3.8 milligrams per liter is if you want to call it, the worst route that you would be exposed, that you would have a risk associated with it. The dermal is much higher, and then oral, is a pretty high number. It's also going to provide some first aid information, and it's going to tell you if there's other potentials, such as toxic gas during a fire or fish kills if it's released into the water, et cetera, et cetera. You can see a few of my examples here. In this case, the hazardous decomposition products. In the case of a fire, if this pesticide were to catch on fire, it may produce carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, hydrogen chloride, and sulfur dioxide. Very important things to know, especially if you have a storage area that is linked to some other occupied building or occupied area, because if a fire were to break out, then these gases may infiltrate those areas long before the fire does. It's also going to tell you, contaminated work clothing should not be allowed out of the workplace. That means don't take your work clothes home. Don't wash them at home. And that doesn't matter whether it's official PPE or just those long sleeve shirts, long pants. If you're working with pesticides, you should not bring them home or out of the workplace. All right, a little bit about flammability. SDS is going to tell you about flammability. The pesticide label does not, unless there is a specific ingredient in there that causes hazard. Some of our pesticides are petroleum based, so there will be a little warning on there, but it doesn't provide the level of information that an SDS does. So again, here's that hazardous decompositions product statement. It's also going to tell you what your suitable extinguishing media is. So in this case, if you were to have a fire with this product, you can use water spray, dry chemical, foam, or carbon dioxide as your extinguishing media. It's going to tell you if there's unsuitable extinguishing media. In this case, high volume water jet. Where do we get high volume water during a fire? It's typically going to come from our first responders when they come up with their fire hoses, and it's because this can cause spread that material out and cause a huge contamination risk. There's also some other things that we have to be cautious of that may not be direct fire, but like catching on fire, but could be explosion hazards. In this case, it says that the container may rupture from gas generation in a fire situation, because basically it's heating up all around it, it's volatilizing that material in that container, and then that container can now become a projectile or an explosion hazard. It also tells you that dense smoke is produced when product burns. So again, another hazard that you need to be aware of. Question number 4, let's see who knows about their fire extinguishers. Which materials is a fire extinguisher rated A, B, C to be used on? Is it A, paper, flammable liquids, and flammable gases, B, paper, cooking oil, and wood, C, flammable metals and electrical, or D, anything flammable? So I'm going to give you a few seconds to answer this question. All right, let's see how you did. A, B, and C is for paper, flammable liquids, and flammable gases. So, do you have the correct fire extinguisher? Now, again, if you look at the SDS sheets, it's going to tell you what is acceptable fire extinguisher methods. If we look at how they're rated, Class A is a water-based fire extinguisher. B is a dry powder, these are different types also, but the Class A's tell you what you can use them on. So we have water fire extinguishers, dry powder, we have foam, carbon dioxide, and wet chemical, and they'll tell you what you cannot use it on. And so you need to make sure that what your pesticides characteristics are, that you have the right fire extinguisher present. Where should those be? Well, they should be in your storage areas. They should be in your vehicles that transport these, even if you're only transporting the solution, that's already mixed in the tank. You should still have the fire extinguisher available. They should be in another place that somebody else could grab in the case of emergency, in case the fire was next to the storage unit and you couldn't get to that fire extinguisher. But more importantly, you need to make sure you have the most appropriate one. Otherwise, you can cause more damage or even harm yourself. All right, oxidation potential. So again, the SDS is going to list this. Essentially, oxidation means that it's going to produce oxygen, which makes other things around it more flammable. So in section 2, the hazards identification, you may find notes about whether or not this is an oxidizing agent. So a lot of our cleaning products, disinfectant products, sodium hypochlorite like bleach, peroxides, and other solvents are oxidizing agents. And we definitely have those in the pesticide world because our disinfectants and antimicrobials are registered pesticides, but some of our solvents are there as well. All right, so other incompatibilities, other things that we need to look at. Again, this is not information that you're going to find on the pesticide label. You're going to find this on the SDS sheet. So here are just some examples. For the one on the left, stability and reactivity, this tells you that there's incompatible materials. So avoid contact with oxidizing materials. Avoid contact with bases. Well, you may think, well, I'm not, going to put this near any of my bleaches or anything else, but what else is being stored in your storage unit or near your storage unit? A lot of times we have these one central place where we put all materials, all of our chemicals, whether they're cleaning the bathroom chemicals or cleaning the office chemicals or our pesticide chemicals, or maybe there are pesticides in our fertilizers and other types of machinery type chemicals. So we have to look for incompatible because that's going to raise the risk if they're in contact with any of those materials. Other conditions to avoid: protect from frost or heat or direct sunlight. Major player in storage, is your containment unit environmentally controlled? Are you leaving these out in the back of a truck, taking off on early mornings when the frost is still, present, or are you leaving them out during the day? Your jugs and containers in the back of your truck where they have direct sunlight or get really hot. These are going to break down your chemicals. These are going to make your chemicals less effective. So if you don't protect them from environmental conditions, you're basically going to go out there and water grass or put down dry material that isn't going to be effective. And that's not what we want to do. We certainly don't want you to waste your time and money. Here's another example: conditions to avoid. Again, ignition, heat, sparks, open flames. Do you have these in a boiler room where there's an open flame, a pilot light of any sort? Don't avoid prolonged storage. So how long are you keeping your chemicals? Are they dated so that you know when they were purchased and put in that storage room? Are you rotating stock as you go through stuff? Again, avoid prolonged exposure to extreme heat or extreme temperatures. Incompatible materials. This particular product was pretty much incompatible with just about anything. That means it may have to have its own separate storage area within a storage area so that it doesn't have a chance of coming in contact with these elements. All right, so now we're going to take a look at pesticide storage, and I've got this labeled as the good, bad, and ugly. I'm going to make some notes about, site location, materials, security and accessibility, and then of course, what do we do about training for pesticide storage and transportation? Question number 5. Again, on your little sheet of paper, what factors should you, or factors, there could be more than one multiple answer here, should you consider when choosing a storage site for your pesticides? Is it A, location away from unprotected people, B, location from water bodies and wells, C, security and accessibility, or D, environmental conditions, heat, cold water, etc.? And like I said, there could be more than one correct answer. So you can write more than one letter on your little sheet of paper. Just make sure it's all on question 5. All right, so let's move along here. All of those are correct. All of those factors should be considered, and we're going to cover some of those. All right, so here we go. Pesticide storage sites. Sites should be thoughtful, which may not necessarily be the most convenient. All right, so we have to make sure that our pesticide storage sites are away from common areas. They're away from unprotected people. So your office staff or people who don't work with the pesticides directly, but do other, like your mechanics or cleaning crews, anybody who's not protected, who is not aware of those hazards. They need to be away from the sensitive areas like water bodies on site, wells, irrigation systems, again, those flammable areas or things like that. They need to be weather protected, climate controlled to some degree, insulated to the point where products don't freeze and ventilated enough so that they don't get overheated. They need to be secured, whether that's with a lock or only certain individuals have a key or access, or they're in a specific maintenance area where only certain individuals have access to. And then documented and labeled. And we do run into some issues where people say, well, I don't want to label my pesticide storage because that product's really expensive. And I don't want people knowing that I have this expensive product in this particular area. But we have to know that risk and the associated risk with coming across pesticides or not knowing what's in there is far greater than the security aspect, but adding security to it is really how you kind of get around the not labeling. So you have to label your sites. You want to label the sites. If emergency responders have to come to your site because of an emergency, they need to know what door, is it behind door number 1 or door number 2? If you have untrained personnel, maybe you have new employees, they need to know what's behind this door and whether or not they can enter. There's so many reasons why you need documentation. And so don't, let that be a deterrent for making sure that you have proper signage. All right, so other characteristics that you need to consider. Is it big enough to hold all your product? Because here's the deal. I have a closet, and I never seem to have a big enough closet, right? I can never fit everything in the closet. So there's always something that's laying on a chair or another stash place in my room, shoes or somewhere else. Kind of the same thing. We put things based on convenience. If I have a storage room that's too small and I cannot put all of the product in there, your product is going to find a place somewhere else. And at that point, it's probably going to be improperly stored. So we want to make sure that your storage rooms are designed that people don't have to be shifting things around to walk into, that they have adequate storage, shelving space to put chemicals on, that there's we're going to get to the other characteristics of that, but we want to make sure that it is adequate for your stock. And are you buying too much stock? Maybe that's part of the problem too. Maybe you don't need to have 3 years worth of chemical just because it was on sale. You put a lot of things at risk when you buy too much product. Can it be organized? Again, if things are too hard to find, placement becomes convenient. Oh man, I don't want to move all these containers off this shelf here and make room, so I'm just going to put it here on the floor. Or, you know what? I don't have time to go in there and alphabetize or put this in the right order. I'm just going to leave it right by the door. If it can't be organized, people are going to find other ways to put stuff in there, which is going to, make it not safe, but also, potentially impact your chemicals. Again, it has to protect you from exposure or protect the chemicals from exposures, protect people from exposure of those chemicals. You have to be able to easily clean it on a regular basis, but on an emergency basis. If somebody goes in there and a bag busts open and they have dry material everywhere, do you have a non-porous surface that people can sweep that material up and a convenient place to put the material that was cleaned up? Or, are they having to go look for stuff everywhere? Or maybe if they spill liquids, it drips onto everything else, which makes those products contaminated. You have to be able to easily clean every part of it. Can it be secured? Again, accessible only to authorized individuals, whoever they may be in your business. And ventilation. Ventilation is huge. I came from the South, and the South is hot all the time. So ventilation, if you don't have ventilation, you can be knocked out when you open a door of a storage area by the fumes and the buildup, the volatilization of chemicals. So you want to make sure that not only is it ventilating properly, but it's also not near buildings or intake vents where that volatilization can be taken into an unprotected space. All right, question number 6. What type of shelving do you have in your storage area? Metal, wood, plastic, a mix of these, or something else? And I would say if you don't know, you can choose something else or a mix of these. But, A, B, C, D, E, or E, whatever suits your purpose for question number 6. All right. Let's see what we should have. Okay, again, materials. What do we need? Read that SDS and the pesticide label for specific requirements. Your flooring should be non-porous, easy to clean, should not provide any trip hazards. All right, so we make sure it's flat, level, not cracked, should not have other things stored on the floor where you need to access your pesticides. Shelving, again, non-porous, easy to clean, non-reactive. We have a lot of pesticides that react with metals. So if that's the case, you either need to double contain in plastic bins that sit on metal shelving, or change that shelving out, or put different types of shelving in that same storage unit. Lighting, non-reactive. Sparks can ignite materials or fumes that are in the place. You also want to make sure that you have easy to reach switches, that you don't have to meander halfway through a dark storage room to find the switch to turn it on to be able to see what you're doing. And then enough light to be able to read labels. So again, mistakes are made. People go in there, they're looking for an M word, they can't really see anything, so they just pick the first one and it ends up being something that they don't need. And then that, there's always a chain reaction there. All right, so now we're going to look at some pesticide storage areas, and I'm going to ask you, your thoughts. So let's start with this one. Question number 7. And I will give you a little bit more time to look at this photo. Hopefully everybody in the room can see this relatively well. What is wrong with this storage site? And you can write just at least one thing. Again, keep it short and sweet. I didn't give you huge lines on that piece of paper. And I know some of you, have doctor's handwriting, and that's okay. The idea is that we're going to learn from our conversation here, and we don't take off for spelling. I should have mentioned that from the beginning. We're not really checking your answers that closely. We just wanted you to participate and write your thoughts down. So I'm going to give you 20 seconds or so to look at this and write down one thing that you think is wrong with this storage site. All right, so now I'm going to go through a series of slides where we talk about some things that I found wrong. This was an actual site. This is when I worked in the state of Montana. So this was an actual pesticide storage site that was found during an enforcement activity. And we're going to talk about some of the things that we had to have a conversation with this particular owner about. All right, so the first thing, improper and lack of lighting. So this just happened to be during the day. We opened these doors and we have some lighting, but actually some of that is from a flashlight that was being used. You can tell there's some highlights there. There's no lighting, there's no light bulb here. So how is a person supposed to, as we get through these short days, even early spring, be able to go in there and find what they're looking for? All right, what's the next item? Porous and sagging shelving. And that should be very evident throughout, the picture. There's a lot of, pretty much it's all made out of wood and it's sagging, which means that not only is it wood, it's old wood. It probably has too much weight on it, but it's probably absorbed a lot of pesticides. You can see quite a lot of mess in there. Here are some examples. All right, 3 leaking and improperly placed pesticides. And this was actually another container that wasn't even a pesticide. So this was like, oil or something for a small engine. But you can tell that there's leaking in a lot of different places, bags that are broken open. We also have, again, product spills in multiple places, and that's liquids and dry materials. Broken containers that are leaking. And where should you store your dry materials? Well, your dry materials ideally should be above your liquid materials, because if the liquid leaks down, it's going to impact your dry materials. But I know the reality of that is that your dry materials usually come in these really big bags. It's really hard to put those on the top and have your containers, your 2.5s or whatever, lower than that. So really you should have separate areas. Your liquids can be in one area, your dries can be in another, but you really should not have your liquids above your dries, because if there was a leak, then you are impacting other chemicals just by placement. All right, household containers. So we don't talk a lot about this. It doesn't happen very often, but I'm sure that it happens more often than we're finding, is that people are using containers that are not designed for pesticide use, whether it's for measuring or pouring from one container to another, which you have limitations on. You can't just transfer stuff from one container to another, but maybe you're consolidating, half a jug and half a jug. But using improper containers, because people don't necessarily know that pesticides are in this, even though you might write on there with a big black Sharpie marker, use only for pesticide use. We don't want to use anything that resembles a household container that somebody can mistake for something else. All right, so now we're going to look at various storage units that I think hit the mark, or at least have some qualities and characteristics that are desirable for pesticide storage. So the photo on the left, we can see here that is obviously a very roomy storage unit. They have lots of walking space, there are no trip hazards here. They've chosen this sturdy metal shelving with the double containment of all of the little plastic bins for their liquids. They even have some dry material in there. Sure, why not? As long as they're not mixed with liquids. And for the most part, it's organized. You can read the labels. The containers are clean. It almost looks like they don't use these. That's how clean it is. If the material was to spill on the floor, it's easily cleaned up. Good lighting. This was the lighting that was provided, in the building with no supplemental lighting going on. Now on the right-hand side, another good example. They have the storage unit, and even though it's a little tighter space, they do have some liquids above dries, which again, is not ideal, but it's not, against the law or illegal or anything. It's just not ideal. Whatever material they're using for the shelving is sturdy and strong, because they've got quite a few of 2.5 containers on a single shelf, and it's not sagging, it's well supported. But you can tell that containers are labeled, containers are marked, the containers are clean. They even have a storage, a filing cabinet there that has a clipboard on top where they can register who's coming in and out and what materials are leaving and being placed in the storage unit. Adequate lighting. And oh, on the left-hand one, I forgot to mention they have that little fan up there too for ventilation. So that kicks on when you turn on the light, so that helps move some of those vapors out of that room. All right, here are another couple of good examples. The one on the left, again, this is an outdoor storage unit, but it does have some insulation. It has good bright lighting, very sturdy storage shelves. They even have it labeled. Their little letters were corresponding to the types of pesticides that they were using. Excuse me. They have some of their equipment stored in there as well. You can tell that boxes are labeled, containers are clean, nothing is really out of space, and they do have that login sheet there taped to that cabinet as well. On the right-hand side, this is an internal storage. So this is a huge warehouse where they're doing all of their like truck maintenance, their equipment, where they're changing parts and things like that. And around the perimeter, they have all of these cages that store all of their chemicals. And this is a huge right-of-way facility, so they do a lot of DOT work. And as you can see, they've got it locked behind cages, so only certain people have access to the materials. This particular material happens to be flammable, and they have a fire extinguisher right next to that. In the bigger scope, they have multiple fire extinguishers, so if something were to happen, couldn't reach this one, they have other ones that are accessible. They also have things on pallets, so they're not directly sitting on the ground. You can tell that the containers, for the most part, are in really good condition. They did have a couple of containers that kind of got bent during their last use, but they're not compromised. There's no holes or leaks or anything like that in there, and relatively clean. Again, non-porous surface where easily cleaned if there was a spill. All right, so other storage reminders. Never, ever, ever use containers other than pesticide containers to store your pesticides. We see this all the time when it comes to hazardous waste pickup, people putting things in household containers. And this is, a very, very bad practice, and people have died from some of these incidents. Question number 8, so this is the last one for our little worksheets there. Do you have a spill kit in your storage area and your vehicle? Yes, no, or not sure. And you can just write down again A, B, or C here. And hopefully the answer is yes. But remember that spill materials need to be compatible with the materials or the products that you're using. You need to have fire extinguishers when necessary. Look for SDS sheets, and you should have SDS sheets in those storage areas for people to reference in case of a spill. And you need to have your PPE available as well. So these are just some examples of areas that contained those particular products. Waste materials, what do you do with them? You have to dispose of them and store them properly according to the label. We do have recycling programs. You'll have to look at the MDA site for more information there if they're allowed to be recycled. In any case, you do have to triple rinse or power rinse them before disposal, and you must keep them secure and out of commission until they reach their final destination. Transporting, we want to make sure that you do proper vehicle maintenance so that you don't have incidents or accidents on the side of the road. Having a flat tire can throw your entire weight off on your truck, and you can lose a lot of your pesticides in an accident that way. We have to make sure that if you have rigs that have where you're storing your 2.5s, that they are in locked cages or in locked areas, not in the cab of the truck with the passengers. And make sure that you, again, have your SDS, your pesticide labels, your fire extinguisher, PPE, and spill kit in your vehicles in case of emergency or use. Incident response plans, MDA has probably already talked about this, but again, just a reminder, those SDS can tell you a lot of great information that first responders want to know, and that's why you need to have them. But make sure that your storage facility is well marked, that you have some sort of map that you can provide to emergency personnel in case they do need to respond to an incident. Here are some resources for you. NPIC is a great resource, the National Pesticide Information Center. It's through the Oregon State University website. Great resource for other fact sheets and information that the common person would want to know. We also have a link to that incident response plan on the MDA site. We have some new paraquat training requirements that you may or may not need to know, depending on whether you use that product. And then if you need to find SDS sheets, you can go to cdms.net and find those SDS. Those you can pull off a website. Pesticide labels you cannot. You must use the ones on the container, but the CDMS you can, or the SDS you can pull off a website because they are standardized. And that's all I have for you today. So again, I'm Jolene Hendrix, the program manager for the Pesticide Safety Environmental Education Program. Don't forget to turn in your answer sheets for a chance to win a door prize, and the nice MNLA staff will pull a couple of names for those. And if you have any questions, you can always reach out to me and email jhendrix@umn.edu. And with that, I hope you enjoy the rest of your conference.